part of New York City, but you just said that
Yeah.
there were specific areas, and New York City was one of
Right.
those areas.
Let me just add one thing, because perhaps my answers are too long. But as an historian, I was
Yes.
also interested in this because uh, I somehow felt that this was going to be an important historical event as well. In my lifetime, apart from the polio epidemic, countries like the United States and Western Europe just didn't have these kinds of epidemics any longer. So I said this is epidemiologically and historically an interesting event. I just felt that.
Okay, all right. So, how, uh, what made AIDS unique? I mean, what was it? Because I read in the book The AIDS Disaster, and I forgot the author's name, but they said that it was very unique, and it was unique in a sense that it fit well with cities like New York City.
Hmm.
That certain factors like a bad economy and all that stuff contributed to the rise in the crisis. So my question to you is, what other factors were there that really made this disease really spread on its own instead of containing it?
So what was, do you remember what the author said about its uniqueness? What made it specifically different? Just to answer your question, I'm just
I think it was
curious.
the time period that he really said that, okay, because New York City at that time was in economic trouble and they were rebounding from that. So the author was, okay, the author said that maybe that was the reason that, it was ignored for so long, that they just didn't have the money to deal with the problem at that time.
Well, I think money is an issue, is always an issue. And any government sets its priorities.
Okay.
If we had had an earthquake, or if a World Trade Center bombing, we would have found the money, right? It's it's always a political choice. Of course, you know that in 1981, 1982, 1983, the cause of the disease was unknown. Some felt it was a disease due to drug use by gay men and then by IV drug users. Some thought it was due to hypersexuality, multiple partners, which affected the immune system. Some thought it was due to a possible microbial agent, but they didn't know which one.
Mm-hmm.
But the disease was in people who were undesirable. IV drug users were basically invisible or reviled. Gay men had no profile. I mean, it's very different now. It's sort of like being black in the 1940s. You were invisible. To speak about gay men was basically to speak either in terms of revulsion. I mean, when I'm saying this, I mean the broad
Right.
heterosexual community, or to make jokes, gay jokes, or not. But gay men, by and large, except in certain communities, were not seen, and there was very little relationship to heterosexuals and to gays as heterosexuals and gays. So you had two communities who had no standing, and most people didn't really get exercise of the fact that these people were getting the disease. The only time there was a real rise in interest in the newspapers and elsewhere was when the blood supply appeared to be contaminated by the virus or the agent that was causing this disease, and so it would go into the general population. So whenever the so-called general population was seen as vulnerable, there was an interest in AIDS, and otherwise there was very little. And I think that's one of the problems. Until you generate interest, and demand money, and you're not an important political group, you're not going to get the money. You're not going to get the attention. And so I think that was one of the major issues. Should I go into other issues, or is that sufficient?
That's sufficient.
Okay, okay.
I mean, what could you name the other issues actually?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I think it's important in terms of New York City,
Right.
Because New York City was different than San Francisco,
Right.
where the gay population was a larger portion of the general population. San Francisco is a much smaller city. It had had Harvey Milk as a city supervisor. New York City, the gays were relatively small, and the real forces in New York City are Wall Street and real estate and finance. It's much harder to have an impact. But should I talk about why New York City didn't respond well and further? Because there are some important reasons.
Actually, that's one of the questions.
Okay.
So okay.
So AIDS remained relatively invisible in New York City and almost totally invisible nationally. The national government, outside of the CDC, for its own particular reasons, had no interest in this disease, and there was no federal money that was earmarked, special funds that was earmarked for this epidemic in those years. Whatever money there was spent on research within the CDC was money that was transferred from current funds, like for Indian Health, that was transferred to do the AIDS research. This was not treated as an extraordinary event by anybody, and that is why the gay community in places like San Francisco and New York, which had essentially organized around sex in the 70s and had a politics because it was being attacked by the right, transformed itself in the 80s as a consequence of this epidemic into a community that was both politically sophisticated and created agencies, its own social agencies to deal with the illness, with welfare issues, with housing issues, with insurance issues. It reconstructed itself, and there were a lot of wealthy and middle-class gay men who knew how to use the press, and the gay community took ownership of this epidemic, and through Gay Men's Health Crisis and ACT UP and organizations like that, forced AIDS to become a national issue. But we can talk more about New York City in